So I'm here with Dr. Walter Gulick, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Montana State University Billings, right?
Right.
And we're here to discuss this recent edited volume that just came out, American Aesthetics, which he edited with Gary Slater. Relate to, art creation and like going to museums and that whatnot.
Well, the basic idea behind the book is that there's a very rich tradition within American pragmatism primarily, and to some extent process thought, that has been kind of overshadowed by a lot of recent more analytic approaches to aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I call American aesthetics is a sense of reclaiming the importance of this tradition for a number of reasons. One is that it's a very comprehensive kind of approach where it looks at aesthetics not just narrowly as about beauty, as is so often done, but sees it as embedded in perception as such, and particularly in perception as it becomes more clarified. So for me, notions like coherence, for instance, a very basic notion to obviously to philosophy and to argumentation, is basically an aesthetic kind of sense. It's based on a feeling of completeness and comprehensiveness and so forth. And there are lots of ideas like that, I think, that are essentially aesthetic in their character, that get kind of set aside when aesthetic becomes looked at only as a study of the arts and so forth.
Right.
Now, this book, American Aesthetics, is primarily about how aesthetics relates to the art, but not entirely.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, there are 3 essays by Thomas Leddy, David Strong, and Robert Corrington that really looked at aesthetics as connected to how we live our lives. And I love that kind of approach.
Right.
But there are sections that are about theoretical approaches to aesthetics. And so we have people like, Wesley Wildman,
Right.
for instance, Robert Neville, or Randy Osier, or Nicholas Gaskill, who are setting forth, or Gary Slater, setting forth a broader theoretical approach to aesthetics. But they're also, and this thing is very important about the book, there's also an emphasis upon how it's all practice.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding of aesthetics then tries to integrate it with what art historians or art critics do, but also has a broader sense about what philosophers do.
Right.
And I think that's part of this tradition going back to Peirce and to James, and not really recognized very much in James' writing explicitly, but it's really important, this notion of aesthetics in his thought. And he influenced Dewey a lot, and Dewey is kind of the person in
Right.
terms of aesthetics.
Right.
But also, of course, Whitehead contributes a lot. So it's these great figures, and followed up by people like Suzanne Langer and others, who really exemplify what I'm calling American aesthetics. And what I'm claiming is that there have been many different artists that have a kind of American focus on their thought, but there are not many people who are talking about American aesthetics as a unique approach.
Right.
I think that the person who has done that most effectively is Richard Schusterman. And he has an article included in this book on the pragmatist aesthetics of William James. And he's been kind of a pioneer in this area that I really want to give credit to.
Nice.
But he doesn't kind of take it in a more systematic, broader sense the way this book does. What I like about the book is that there are, I've set forth this general conception of what American aesthetics is in an introductory essay. And some people pick up on that, but others just kind of exemplify it in the way where they're writing. Right. They're not necessarily tying to that central article that I had. But they are showing in practice, in performance, and other kind of things, how this concept gets exemplified in actual practice. So that's why it's called American Aesthetics Theory and Practice. And I think that makes it kind of unique. So many philosophical aesthetics are very narrowly philosophical. This tries to look at the broad sense of aesthetics, which involves us as social beings,
Right.
as people with histories that influence how we create art,
Right.
influence how we judge art. All that should be included, in my view, in aesthetics. And I think American aesthetics is a tradition that does that.
So you mentioned your introductory essay here, but you also, in the volume, co-wrote two other essays with,
Yeah.
well, I guess the one you mostly wrote, but one with Leanne Gilbertson that's focusing on Harold Rosenberg, the art critic, and then
Right.
another one that's sort of a dialogue with Corey Dryeth, an
Mm-hmm.
artist that is based maybe in Colorado.
He is. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anything you want to say? How did those essays come about? Anything that you think is especially important that the contribution that they make to the volume?
Sure. I think let's talk about the one with Harold Rosenberg first.
Yeah.
Um, my colleague at Montana University Billings, Leanne Gilbertson, had some, I asked her about, are you doing anything that would be relevant to this kind of a volume? And she said, well, maybe thinking about Harold Rosenberg. And she had some ideas there that I kind of took and then did some more research on him. And I saw, yeah, he really is a critic who understands the importance of the art as in dialogue with the historical and cultural milieu in which it arises. It's not just about aesthetics in a narrow sense of, oh, this is pretty, or this is,
Yeah.
all these narrower concepts. So I was really happy to read a lot of his stuff and see him as he represents this kind of approach as an art critic that I'm representing in terms of, American aesthetics. So that enough about Rosenberg. I think that's really the only article among the 20 in the book that really focuses upon criticism.
Right.
And I thought it was really important to have something there. So that's where I went in that direction. In terms of the interview with Corey Dryeth, that's a kind of a chancy thing in respects, because Corey is not a well-known artist. I love his stuff.
Yeah, it's great.
And so that gave me a first thought about it. But secondly, talking with him, he was a philosophy major and religious studies. And so it influences what he does. And he's able to articulate a lot of the things that many artists don't. They say, well, look at my art. And, it speaks for itself. Well, it's nice to be able to talk to somebody who really has thought through a lot of why he does what it does. So I don't want to say that his art is particularly American in some sense, but the conversation with him in terms of how he creates, again, that our approach in the book is American aesthetics and both theory and practice. Well, he's practicing it in a very thoughtful sort of way. So I wanted to bring that out. There is no other interview with an artist in the book, too.
Right.
So
right.
again, that helps complement the whole structure of the book.
Right.
To make sure that a number of things are covered. A lot, of course, isn't covered in the book, which I'd love to have covered. I mean, I'd love to have dealt with, say, photography. I didn't.
Yeah.
The book's too long as it is, probably.
Yeah. But it is remarkable in terms of, people giving metaphysical accounts of value, people talking to actual artists about art critics, dealing with the practice of performing music.
Yes.
Doing sort of classical, like, history of philosophy, James's perspective, Peirce's perspective. It really does have quite a broad spectrum of what you're talking about is sort of an American sense of aesthetics that is really inclusive. I think this volume does represent that well because it covers.
Well, thanks. That's what I hope it does.
Yeah.
And even though we can't do all the kind of things, I love to do something on dance, for instance, or also creative thought, say in science or other things. I mean, because aesthetics deals with all these kind of different disciplines.
Right. Or even, I think about like aesthetics and mathematics is a really such a crucial part of mathematics. Like when I think about Whitehead, that's one of the things that really stands out to me about his thinking, his writing. it's like it's got a mathematician's sensibility about aesthetics running all throughout it, you know.
Excellent point. Yep,
Yeah.
I sure agree with you.
Yeah.
We'll have to do a second volume. Maybe
That's what I was gonna
get together
say.
and do
We had to do volumes 2 and 3, you know.
That's right. So yeah, there's just a rich vein of material that I hope other people can pick up and run with, you know?
Yeah, that's great. Right. I'm here with Dr. Gary Slater, a good friend and colleague, to talk about this recent book that's just published, American Aesthetics, Theory and Practice. So Gary, thank you so much for being here and being a part of this interview. I wonder if you just start and tell us just a little bit about yourself, your research, where are you at right now, where are you located, and yeah, just a little
All right.
introduction.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for having me in this conversation, Dr. Rohr. And, good to catch up with you and to have this opportunity to talk about my own work and obviously this book in particular. So I am here in Munster, Germany, and I am about 25% of the way through a Humboldt Fellowship, working on a project that is trying to develop an integrated ethics of migration and ecology. The assumption being that international migration and environmental devastation represent challenges which will only get more urgent in the decades ahead. And so I'm applying some of the logic of relations that I developed in my research on Charles Peirce to look at the relationship between religious traditions and these challenges as part of a kind of common challenge. And so it is something that has definite connections with the work I did before, but it would really only be described as religious ethics as opposed to philosophy of religion, which is more of what I was doing in my dissertation, in my doctorate, and certainly for the first few years afterward. But as a loyal member of the Institute for American Religious and Philosophical Thought and a staunch pragmatist myself, I do consider this to be in the fold, at least in some manner of speaking. And so as we were talking about before, I mean, it's very much pragmatic in spirit of, taking a set of lived values as part of a community and searching for ways to help communities solve problems and apply those values to new settings in a kind of hypothetical manner, abductive manner. And so somewhere along the line, there's also a dilettante's interest in American aesthetics as well. And so not really related to this project, but sure. One can be a Renaissance man and write about different things. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I wonder if for any readers who might not have much of a context, I wonder if you could just say, so what is philosophical aesthetics? What is this book about in the general sense? What's the purpose of philosophical aesthetics?
Well, aesthetics, of course, has a pretty venerable legacy in ancient Greece. It's right there at the ground floor with ethics and metaphysics and all the other great Greek sub-disciplines of the life of the mind, philosophy, and so it's I think almost so important and so ubiquitous that it's easy to overlook.
Yeah.
In the sense that we're obviously embodied creatures living in a world that exceeds ourselves, and our experience in this world is profuse with experiences that are laden with value and indeed with beauty, not just beauty, but some kind of almost indescribable visceral element in which you're experiencing something, but you can also apprehend patterns and forms, and there's absolutely something to that goes beyond a simple logical connection, or even a simple ethical distinction between a right or wrong course of action. Right. And so I remember reading what's it called? I think it's Musicophilia by the neurologist Oliver Sacks.
Oh yeah.
And he was talking about what it would be like to try to describe music to some sort of alien species that landed on Earth. And if you played them Beethoven's Ninth symphony, you know, they might sort of be polite and acknowledge the repeating phrases or, you know, certain kinds of, you know, noteworthy patterns, but you know, you wouldn't be able to communicate what makes it so powerful as an emotional experience in conjunction with the arrangement of sounds. And so aesthetics is what really tries to go into that really elemental, really visceral aspect of experience. And so what this book that has just come out, I would say, is contributing to the understanding of aesthetics, is it's retrieving a tradition that comes out of the traditions that IART is interested in,
right?
The American philosophical tradition, particularly the classical pragmatists and their successors, and arguing that even though these figures are not typically understood as aestheticians, primarily, they are developing obviously more famous philosophical ideas about meaning and value and experience and democracy and education and of course religion, that can lend themselves to a relatively coherent aesthetic approach, and that isn't something that had been talked about enough. And so it's assembling in particularly just sort of using the expertise that is present in IART, although of course other contributors who aren't in the group also contributed chapters. But it's taking those who appreciate and understand American intellectual traditions to pull together a pretty convincing case that there is something that is uniquely American, or at least you know, philosophically American, that also has something to say about aesthetics.
Great. So I realize it's getting dark there in Germany, so
yeah.
We'll wrap this up here quick. But I'm curious, as I believe the American Aesthetics volume is the first volume you've edited.
Yes, it is.
You have your own published monograph. I'm curious, what were some of the challenges and rewarding aspects, or anything you learned as a young scholar editing your first book?
Thanks for asking. I mean, I really do. I mean, I do the same acknowledgments, but just for here as well, I have to really give Walter Gulick the lion's share of credit for making this project a reality. It was his idea from the beginning. It honestly was, for me, it was just basically an example of the virtues of commitment and sort of holding fast, being patient and persistent to an idea, and you know, not wanting to give up on something that seemed worthwhile. And so, you know, it just sort of in 2015 in Asheville, I knew that Walt was interested in having a theme of the IARP summer meeting be aesthetics. And so I had worked with Bill Hart as a program co-chair before on, you know, taking the various submitted proposals and turning them into a conference program. And so, you know, I agreed to help Walt do that for the 2016 meeting. And so doing that, of course, acquainted me. Yeah, exactly. Just sort of, you know, it's one of those things, I'm sure you know this experience, where you don't really want to say no to things that fall into your space. And so I'm like, all right, I you know, I want to do this. And so, you know, anything that you know, develops your relationships with other scholars in your orbit and things like that. And so you know, that familiarized me with a lot of the projects that became the chapters of the book. And so that summer of 2016 and the weeks after the meeting, you know, Walt and I had various conversations about what we hoped we could do with it. And you know, my understanding is that, you know, I doubt that most summer meetings are so seriously looked at as an edited book. I know that my 2014 program co-chair experience was not. And so, you know, I have to hand it to Walt for thinking like, look, this really ought to be something that's published as a book. And so, you know, we thought about where it would go, and SUNY Press was an obvious contender from the beginning, just based on what their interests are and who they've published. And so it really just took a long time. It was sort of the kind of thing that I don't know, it really was. There was Walt, I think, because he was so emotionally invested in making this thing happen. There were times where I thought he was really like maybe on the verge of thinking that, like, man, like, I don't know if this is worth it, the things that they are asking of us or how long it's taking. But at any rate, in my experience, I mean, really honestly, like the skills involved in reading somebody else. I mean, I was reviews editor of the HATP for 5 years, and now I'm the editor-in-chief of that. And so, like, anytime someone gives you a chapter or a manuscript, and you have to read someone else's work closely, it takes a certain kind of empathy without losing your kind of critical sensibilities as well. And you also, you have to think of it in a context that the author themselves probably hadn't thought about, which is, what their project looks like alongside all the other ones that got submitted.
Sure.
And so I guess in the sense of an edited book like this, I mean, it's just even bigger than any one issue of a journal, which is usually only, 4 or 5 articles. This was so much bigger. And so I think it's one of the great strengths of the book, the way it's arranged.
Yeah.
And I have to give Walt credit for that, because, just sort of taking all these really quite diverse, and like you said, you pointed out the different approaches, different historical interests, different genres, all of it, and putting it together is really an interesting challenge. And so it was challenging, but we worked together on it, and just a lot of back and forth with some of the authors, having to look at things that might not fit as well as others. And of course, when the reviewer feedback does come in, you have to also think about how you're going to respond to that. And anybody who's ever gone through that process with their own submitted stuff for a journal, that can be a little frustrating. You always feel like the reviewer didn't quite understand what you're trying to do, or whatever. But you have to hope, and I think it's an article of faith that you think that this is all toward a process of improvement, that the end result will look better as a result of this process of feedback. And I think it did. I do. And so I think it's better now, having gone through all these years. Gosh, it's like almost 4 years since that summer meeting in Manitou. And so, I'm just glad that it exists. I haven't actually got my copy. No, I haven't held it in my hand. I love that feeling. It's funny, like my older brother is a musician, to talk about aesthetics, and and this goes to some of what you do in your chapter. Like, there's almost this process of artistic recognition, and like the relationship you have with your own work, and the desire to make it better, and like the kind of relationship between taste and standards, and how you look at your own work. I think that you have a quotation from Ira Glass about like how like you're not very good at first, but you have to be willing to get better. Right. And so like musicians sometimes talk about what it's like to hear their own song on the radio for the first time, how exciting that is.
Yeah.
And so like I feel like as somebody who like made something, like the feeling of like getting the book out of the box, and like as an aesthetic object, like looking at the cover, I just think it looks great.
It does.
The book, it looks great. It's really neat.
Cool that story drives art on the cover.
Oh, I know. I love it. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And so, I want to have that, man. I want to have it on my shelf. I want to hold it. I want to reread it. And then, like it's not done, like the story continues, because the book will, of course, it'll age and it'll evolve, and what you do with it and how you think about it. And so like, I look forward to 5 years from now, 10 years from now, like rereading your chapter, or Wildman's chapter, or anybody's, and sort of seeing what I might discover that I didn't discover before.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really excellent book, and something you should be very proud of, Gary. So congrats on the book, and thank you so much for being willing to sit and talk with me.
My pleasure, Dave. Great to talk to you. Thank you for the kind words, and I am proud of it. I think that it's an accomplishment whenever a book gets published, and just sort of, and in this case, the fact that it's the result of so many different contributors, I think it's really fascinating. It's a very collegial experience, and so congratulations to everyone involved, including yourself. And so thank you very much for taking the time and showing the interest to talk to me. And